Have you ever felt that God remains silent just when you need Him the most? Have you wondered why His name doesn't seem to appear in certain stages of your life, especially the most difficult ones? Although you know He is still present, it is possible that in those moments where it seems God is not speaking, He is actually writing something larger than what you can see. The book of Esther is unique in the entire Bible. It never mentions the name of God, nor does it present a visible miracle, yet it is full of His hand moving behind the scenes. Before we reveal how God works in the shadows, we invite you to subscribe to our channel at Bible Says It. Join our community to explore deep biblical reflections that will strengthen your walk with Christ. Under a pagan government, without a temple or a prophet, God preserves His people through decisions, silences, and courage. Esther was not born a queen. She was a young orphan and a foreigner until God sovereignly positioned her for an eternal purpose. Her story reminds us that God does not need thunder or fire to manifest His will. Sometimes His plan unfolds in the quietness of a conversation or in the obedience of a difficult decision. Prepare to discover that the story of Esther is a prophetic mirror of what God wants to do with you today. Sometimes, the divine plan does not manifest in the spectacular, but in the quietness of a conversation, in the courage of a prayer, or in the silent obedience of a difficult decision. If today you feel you are in an environment you don't understand or that even feels uncomfortable, remember that the absence of noise does not mean an absence of a plan. The God who does not appear explicitly in the text of Esther is present in every line of history, orchestrating destinies from eternity. The story of Esther begins with a massive display of human power, a proud king, and banquets of excess. We find ourselves in the Persian Empire, where King Ahasuerus ruled over 127 provinces, stretching from India to Ethiopia. Amidst the luxury, protocols, and royal decrees, God appears to be completely absent. There are no recorded prayers, visions, or angels during this stage. However, the king's pride eventually leads to a domestic conflict when Queen Vashti refuses to present herself before his guests. Humiliated and influenced by proud advisors, the king takes the radical decision to remove her from her position. While this looks like a mere political affair, in heaven, God was already aligning events to position a young Jewish orphan in the place of highest influence. Esther was a young woman without a title, political connections, or royal lineage, raised by her cousin Mordecai. She had nothing the world would consider powerful, but she possessed something the favor of God recognizes: humility, grace, and obedience. When the search for a new queen began, Esther was taken to the palace as just one among many. To human eyes, this looked like a lottery or a superficial beauty pageant, but the God who never improvises had already chosen her. Before her promotion, Esther underwent a 12-month process of preparation involving oils, myrrh, and perfumes. This detail serves as a powerful spiritual lesson. There is no purpose without preparation and no position without a process. These fragrances represent character, maturity, and spiritual readiness. Esther did not force her way to the top or manipulate her surroundings. She simply walked in dignity and obedience. Finally, when her turn came, she found favor in the eyes of the king more than all the others, and he placed the royal crown upon her head. God forms queens in the corners of exile and prepares His chosen ones in the silence of the process. In the midst of a palace filled with intrigue, political power, and strategic maneuvers, a character appears who seeks neither a throne nor recognition: Mordecai. He is not a king, a nobleman, or a priest. He is a displaced Jewish man, an exile who remains firm, silent, and vigilant. Although he does not occupy a central place in the limelight, he becomes a hidden pillar of God's purpose. Mordecai had not only raised Esther as his own daughter but continued to watch over her closely even after she was taken into the palace. The text notes that he sat at the king's gate, a location that, in Persian culture, was far more than a simple entrance. It was the nerve center for decisions, rumors, and the kingdom's secrets, the place where judicial and administrative affairs were conducted. While positioned there by God, Mordecai overhears a dark plot. Two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, were planning to assassinate King Ahasuerus. Mordecai immediately informs Queen Esther, who reports it to the king in Mordecai's name. An investigation is held, the plot is thwarted, and the conspirators are executed. However, something strange happens. Mordecai is not rewarded immediately. His name is simply recorded in the book of the King's Chronicles, and then, nothing but silence. No honor, no reward, and no promotion follow this act of loyalty. Here lies a powerful lesson. Faithfulness is often not recognized instantly, but it is never forgotten by God. Mordecai was not seeking glory. He acted with integrity, and while men temporarily forgot him, heaven was recording his obedience. There are small acts that seem insignificant but are actually building invisible platforms for God's future movements. If you feel forgotten today after doing what is right, remember that God is writing your name in His eternal book. Heaven does not forget those who sow faithfulness in silence. Whenever God is working in favor of His people, the enemy reacts. The book of Esther takes a dramatic turn with the appearance of Haman, a man elevated to the second highest position of authority in the entire Persian Empire. King Ahasuerus granted him immense power and prestige, and everyone was expected to bow before him, except for one man, Mordecai. This act of firmness was not political rebellion or personal arrogance. It was a profound spiritual conviction. Mordecai refused to prostrate himself before any man because his ultimate loyalty belonged to the true God alone. Haman's pride could not tolerate the slight, and his wounded ego transformed into an unmeasured hatred. It wasn't enough for him to punish Mordecai. He sought to exterminate his entire people and erase the Jews from the empire. This hatred reveals a deep spiritual reality. The struggle is not merely between men, but between the powers of darkness and God's eternal plan. Haman thus becomes a prophetic figure of the enemy who has tried to destroy God's people throughout history. Using cunning, Haman convinced the king to issue an official decree. He promised money and political stability, while the king, indifferent and superficial, handed over his royal ring, and with it, the power to seal a death sentence. The edict was sent to every province, placing the entire empire under a mandate of death. The enemy launched this attack believing God's people were defenseless. What Haman did not know was that although God's name is not in the text, His hand was already in motion, Esther was already in the palace, and Mordecai was positioned at the gate. This teaches us that every true purpose will face opposition, but pride will eventually face God's justice. Haman believed he had secured his victory, but he was actually signing his own sentence. The news of the death decree against the Jews spread like wildfire throughout the empire, bringing mourning, fasting, and despair to every city. However, no one carried a heavier spiritual burden than Mordecai. He, who had been a vigilant watchman at the palace gate, now dressed in sackcloth and ashes, crying out at the very entrance where power resided. Although he could not physically enter the palace in that state, he knew he had to trigger a movement from within, understanding that salvation would not come through natural means alone. Esther, meanwhile, was living in a palace bubble, surrounded by comforts and initially unaware of the magnitude of the danger threatening her people. When she saw Mordecai's distress, her first instinct was a superficial one. She sent him clothes so he would remove his mourning. It was only after Mordecai sent back the details of the edict and demanded she intercede before the king that Esther was forced to face the tension between her personal security and her spiritual identity. Initially, Esther's response was purely human, fear. She reminded Mordecai that approaching the king without being summoned was a death sentence. But Mordecai didn't offer comfort, he offered an eternal confrontation. If you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? With those words, Esther realized she wasn't in the palace because of her beauty or by mere chance. She had been sovereignly positioned by God as an instrument of salvation. Her fear transformed into unshakable determination. She requested a 3-day fast from all Jews and made her legendary declaration, "I will go to the king, and if I perish, I perish." In that moment, a true queen was born, not through a coronation, but through the decision to risk everything for a purpose greater than herself. After 3 days of fasting, Esther stands before the king without being summoned, knowing her life hangs in the balance. She does not act out of emotional pressure but with a strategy born from intimacy with God. Having emptied herself, she depends entirely on the favor that only heaven can provide. When the king sees her, he extends his golden scepter, preserving her life and signaling that the spiritual atmosphere has shifted. He even offers her up to half of his kingdom, but Esther's purpose requires more than just a favor, it requires divine precision. Instead of presenting her plea immediately, she invites the king and Haman to a banquet. This reveals a key spiritual principle: true wisdom knows when to speak and when to wait. Even after the first banquet, her discernment leads her to invite them to a second one. Meanwhile, Haman leaves exhilarated, yet his ego is shattered because Mordecai still refuses to bow at the gate. Fueled by fury, Haman builds a gallows 20 meters high, believing his revenge is imminent. He has no idea that the very next night will be the beginning of his downfall. That night, the king is struck with a divinely provoked insomnia. Unable to sleep, he asks for the Chronicles of the Kingdom to be read, and in those pages, he stumbles upon the forgotten account of how Mordecai saved his life years ago. Discovering that Mordecai was never rewarded, the king decides to honor him at once. In a moment of supreme irony, Haman enters the court to ask for Mordecai's execution, only to be ordered by the king to personally exalt him through the city streets. This dramatic reversal is the work of Providence, God orchestrating every detail, every interrupted dream, and every forgotten act of faithfulness to ensure his plan never arrives late. The story reaches its point of maximum tension as the second banquet begins. Haman has enjoyed prestige and power, but the justice of God is about to resonate with a clarity that is impossible to ignore. During this banquet, Esther finally reveals her identity and her petition. She does not defend herself, but her people. She does not speak with hatred, but with a clarity born of fasting, preparation, and obedience. She declares, "We have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed and to be annihilated." This revelation strikes King Ahasuerus with immense force, as he had not realized that Esther was Jewish, nor that the decree he signed sealed the destruction of his own wife's people. The enemy is identified, the plan is exposed, and justice must be executed. Haman, the man who felt invincible, falls into a total panic. He begs for his life, but it is too late, his arrogance has reached its limit. The king, rising in anger, returns to find Haman prostrate on the couch where Esther was, interpreting the act as a final insult and offense. In a turn that only God can orchestrate, a eunuch reveals that Haman had built a gallows for Mordecai. At that moment, the divine sentence is fulfilled. The king orders Haman to be hanged on the very gallows he prepared for the just man. What the enemy built for evil turns against him, and what seemed irreversible is overturned in a single day. Mordecai, the man once ignored, is now recognized, honored, and exalted to the position of authority that Haman once held. We learn here that God allows evil to develop only to the point where His glory will be greater in bringing it down. The gallows represent the destiny of the enemy, but also the supernatural reversal that God provokes when His children remain faithful through the process. The story that began under a threat of total annihilation concludes with a vibrant national celebration. The people once condemned to die now walk with authority, honor, and freedom. This death decree was reversed not by military force or simple vengeance, but through the favor of God, the obedience of His servants, and a strategy woven in divine silence. Chapter 8 shows Esther receiving Haman's house while Mordecai is invested with the royal ring. Although the original edict of death could not be revoked under Persian law, the king allowed Esther and Mordecai to write a new decree to counter the previous one. This new decree of life authorized the Jews to defend themselves and resist their enemies. The day originally designated for extermination became the day the enemies were defeated. Instead of mourning, there was joy; instead of defeat, there was victory. The Jews prevailed and lived to tell of what God did for them, even though His name was never explicitly mentioned. This triumph led to the establishment of the Feast of Purim. This feast is more than just a commemoration, it is a profound spiritual declaration. Every year, the people would remember how their sadness was transformed into joy and how the edict of hell was neutralized by divine intervention. The celebration includes banquets, the exchange of gifts, and generosity toward the poor, serving as a sign of the fullness that follows complete salvation. Esther and Mordecai established that this memory must be passed down to every generation because what is not remembered is repeated, and what is not celebrated is forgotten. The victory was sealed with gratitude, transforming the enemy's plan for evil into a platform of glory. Ultimately, the servant Mordecai became a prince, and the queen who risked her life became a savior of her people. The Book of Esther stands as a masterpiece of divine providence. Although the name of God never appears, His presence is more powerful here than in many accounts where His voice is heard directly. This story reveals a God who does not need to be announced to act, who requires no thunders to move, and who transforms in silence while saving without being seen. From the king's banquets to Mordecai's eventual exaltation, we see a great architect positioning and aligning every heart and every moment. Nothing, not Haman's pride, Esther's initial fear, nor Mordecai's temporary neglect, is out of his control. Esther teaches us that divine purpose does not depend on spiritual visibility, but on personal faithfulness. Even when you cannot see God, He is seeing for you. Even when you cannot hear His voice, He is writing your story. He prepares, plants, and molds His children long before danger arrives, just as Esther was placed in the palace before the decree of death was ever written. His apparent inactivity is actually the strategic movement of pieces without human interference until the time is right to reveal the stage. Esther did not truly become queen on her coronation day, but on the day she surrendered her life to a purpose larger than herself. Likewise, you are living in a prophetic time. If you are breathing and if you carry a weight in your heart, It is because you have been planted for this hour, not to be silent or afraid, but to act and reveal God in your world. When all is fulfilled, you will discover that every silence from God was actually part of the thunder of His faithfulness. To continue growing in the Word, we invite you to subscribe to our channel Sabiduria Biblica for more in-depth studies.